You're welcome. Councilwoman Petty.
Hi. Okay, so the information that you had listed that would be helpful with the analysis is the core description, the core analysis, logging information, right? Yeah. So how did Hacker and Morrison and Terra arrive at their estimates if they didn't use those assumptions?
How detailed do you want?
Well, I mean, this is a study session, so honestly, I want to understand it better.
Some of the reports I've seen, I can't tell you how they arrived at their conclusion exactly. But I can kind of give you a flavor for either what CBA report says or other reports. So the first thing that needs to be derived is the cube, the size. You have that with Hermosa Beach. You know what your city limits are. The second is to understand how much sand is in the ground that could be oil bearing. So you're coming up a volume. Once you figure out the sand, then you have to, so say you have a sand layer that extends all the way from one edge of town to the other, north, south, east, west. Chances are that the oil volume where there is producible oil will not extend on all four corners. It will be limited to a certain area. So that's the next question that has to be resolved is how far extensive is that oil? I can probably go into more detail, but in effect, you have to determine where the sand is, how much volume is in that sand, how much pore space is left in that sand for oil to be in, how much water and oil is in those sand layers, to come up with what your volume of oil is in place, what your original oil place number is in. How they came up with those numbers, they used some similar oil fields where they had additional information. This field in Southern California is going to be similar to other oil fields in Southern California in some respects. It won't be exactly the same. There are factors in there that'll be slightly different. So they did their best estimate, just as the CBA reports also did, to come up with all those factors to go into coming up with that oil in place number.
Okay. So for the, there was 5.7 is the volumetrics. And so what this paragraph is talking about, it's talking about net to gross ratios. And
right.
What it looks like happened was, so you refer to Intera, and it says they reduced the net to gross ratios from 0.3 for all of the zones to 0.14, 0.17, and 0.06. So I was trying to understand what that really meant, because it kind of looked like a mathematical kind of experiment here to a certain extent, because I was able to run those numbers and do some division and do some multiplication, but I don't really understand why that's done.
What the all right.
Curtis, excuse me. Chief, do you mind coming up here for a second? You can keep going. I just wanted to interrupt you. Go ahead. Go ahead, Curtis.
Okay, so what Hacker did originally, they broke down their oil in place numbers by layers. So there are certain defined geological layers in the field. One is the top main, one's bottom main, Del Amo. So those sections have a physical height and depth. So the top of the main is at, say, 2,000 feet below sea level, and the bottom of the top of the main, sorry, say mine is 2,500 feet, so it's 500 feet thick. So what Hacker did, and maybe some of the other reports did also, they determined that their estimated how much sand was in that 500 feet was 30%. You okay now? Still, we're good up to that point? Okay.
Yes.
So, the Intera report, the 97 Intera report, which was for Redondo Beach, also started with that same net to gross ratio. So they said 30% of the zones were considered sand. Then they took the production information and they did what is called a material balance. They put all the production data they had in for the offshore section of Redondo Beach. And by putting that information in, they came up with a oil in place number based on that oil production number. So it's getting off my. Then they tried to match that with the oil in place number they derived geologically by using that net to gross ratio, and the two did not total up. They should come up theoretically the same or close to the same number. So what you have is an actual number, because you have production information. You also have geological estimate of what the oil in place number is, and they should match up. But they found out they could not, and so they lowered the amount of oil in place by, in part, decreasing the amount of sand in the layers to make the two numbers jive.
Got it. Okay. So if anybody goes back later and takes a look at the report, on page 24, table 1 shows the Intera report of 1996, and that shows total estimation original oil in place of 218 million stock tank barrels. That number then, I guess to a certain extent, is grossed up by the 0.3 and then brought down for each layer accordingly, right? The 0.14, the 0.17, and
Correct.
And the 0.06. And I just think it's good for everybody to understand where these numbers come from. That's why I'm specifically pointing to it. So basically, a lot of these estimates come from Intera. Somebody kind of goes back, vets what Intera said doesn't seem to really mesh with some other information, and that brings us down to the 87 million stock tank barrel recalculation in Intera. Do I have that right?
Correct.
Got it. Okay. So, just so I got that clear. Then I try to understand, which is like kind of the crux of everything, which is this report. And so then this report, it's another set of numbers. And so how do you get to that number?
From the CBA report, so instead of doing a net to gross ratio of that, let's go back to the top of the main. So you got 500 feet thick. So what we had available was the actual log information. Log information will show you, in theory, where the sand layers are and where the oil is. So it's a little bit more tedious in part. With computers, it's a little easier at times now. But we actually counted up how much oil-bearing sand was in each of the top of the main, and use that number instead of the net to gross ratio, and mapped that information to help come up with the oil in place number. So it's a slightly different methodology, and it's trying to use the available information we had.
Got it. So then, just so I'm clear on, because then the basis of this report really is the Intera report.
The basis report is not the Intera report.
Well, I guess the reason that I'm thinking it is because then I look at this and because it's listed as Intera and then Intera recalculated and then this report, I kind of look at this and think, okay, there's a correlation. Do you see what I mean between Intera and Intera recalculated and this report? But is it not necessarily a correlation between the three? I mean, I'm just kind of, as a layperson, right? I look at this and think, well, I see this, I see this, I see that, so I think somehow the three are kind of linked. That's why I'm asking that question.
I'd say the only link would be that how they're deriving. I'm not trying to say how Intera did all their work, but we probably used about the same information. We may have used it slightly different or Like I said, Intera did just a gross number of how much sand is in it. I tried to do a little bit more detail and map that information. Are they tied? Only in the source data.
So when there's kind of these three groups of numbers, is it more of kind of a frame of reference
It's
for us?
It's more of a frame of reference. I mean, the Intera report had a lot more detail than any of the other reports I had in my hand. So I could try to utilize it and frame. Intera never went back and did what I did on Hermosa, but all the information was right there. So there's no correlation between the reports in that, except that they were looking at the same data.
Got it. So then, because there were so many different studies conducted, it seems to me as I look at this, there's Hacker again, and then there's Morris and Intera again. All of these different
but
studies.
I didn't have the detail I had for Intera.
Right. Okay. So then, even in terms of these other studies that have come forth, in the end, we could have 50 studies, but it's the amount of information that's available in those studies that will matter in terms of whether or not they're valuable information. Is that right, if I have that right?
Correct.
Okay. So we could have 1,000 reports, but if there is scant detail for us, you can only go so far. So
I'd have to make a lot more interpretations of how they derived their information, and then you're looking at guesswork at that point in time.
got it. Okay. I'm just trying to get the frame of reference because there is a lot of reports, and we all got a supplemental, and there's more reports. But in the end, it's the information included in those reports that will determine whether or not it's valuable. So I guess I understand we could give you 50 reports, but you're going to have to look at them and decide if there's data that goes beyond what you have today to make it a worthwhile, not experiment, but situation. I just want to, do I have that correct?
But again, sorry. Pass this line? I mean, there you go. I think we just have to rely on that first bullet point again. It is a professional opinion based upon the available information.
Right, right.
And that's what anybody's going to do. So.
Exactly. And I just want you to know, I mean, the purpose of this is for us to learn. I know there's a lot of people in the room, and you're kind of under the spotlight, but I'm just trying to, as part of the study session, just truly understand this, and for the people who have really gone through this, they might have some of these same questions too. So those are my questions on original oil in place.
Okay, great.